Here we go. Alrighty, well, hello everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And back on the program, we are rejoined by Fiona Edwards. Fiona is a member of No Cold War Britain, which is trying to mobilize the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement and the left to be against the ongoing NATO wars and the new Cold War on China, known as the pivot to Asia. She also writes for Eyes on Latin America. She follows a lot what's going on Latin America, and her work has been published at Morning Star, which is Britain's largest socialist newspaper. And overall, a great friend to all people power movements, and let's get into it. So, Fiona, first off, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
Oh, Youri, it's great to be here, and thanks for that very complimentary introduction. It's really great to be here with you today.
Hey, you deserve it. You're the one that does all this, all this incredible work. And so, so it's an honor to have you back on the program. And so let's get into some of these topics related to foreign policy. The first question, though, I wanted to ask you is, I've noticed that you've been mobilizing a lot of Palestine solidarity protests and events, and trying to keep everybody informed online with the tragic situation that's going on yet again in Palestine. So I just wanted to ask you, since there's been large protests going on, not just globally, but particularly in Britain. So I just wanted your, what's your, response in general to the situation that's going on in Palestine? Talk to us about some of the protests that you've been involved in, and just in general, your reflections on, your reflections on them, and where do you see the Palestine solidarity movement and the quest for justice of Palestine going from here, actually?
Well, I think we're in a really important moment in history, actually, and I think it's a very important moment in international politics. I think there's a real polarization, but we really have to understand one fundamental thing, which is that the overwhelming majority of the world right now is standing with the Palestinians. They're demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, and also to address the underlying reasons for why there is this situation, which is the oppression of the Palestinians over 75 years. So I think it's really important at this moment to understand we are in a majority, but it's unfortunately the case that the United States is completely supporting Israel. And I think some people don't really understand the extent to which this is the United States war. There's a lot of PR where you've got the US Secretary of State doing a tour of the world saying, we want Israel to be more humanitarian in its genocide on Gaza. And it's just PR, because where are they getting
proposal?
Say again?
A modest proposal, like Jonathan Swift, when there was like the whole Irish famine, and he wrote that satire of like a modest like proposal. That's kind of like what they mean when they say these things like humanitarian pause. And
there's nothing humanitarian about what's happening, what Israel is doing. And there's actually a quote I'd like to raise at this point from a retired IDF Major General Brick, and he puts it very bluntly about the role of the United States in things. He says, all of our missiles, the ammunition, the precision guided bombs, all the airplanes and the bombs, it's all from the United States. The minute they turn off the tap, you can't keep fighting. You have no capability. Everyone understands that we can't fight this war without the United States, period. And I mean, it couldn't be more clear. I mean, the United States has armed Israel to the teeth for decades. It's currently $3.8 billion a year given to Israel. And the Biden administration is currently trying to get agreed a new package of military support for Israel of $14 billion. So this is where things are going. So all of this sort of PR campaign about how the United States really cares about humanitarian issues, it's complete rubbish. They're supporting the siege on Gaza, they're supporting the bombardment, and they are blocking diplomatic efforts for a ceasefire at the United Nations. So, we're talking now, many weeks ago, on the 20th of October, 140 countries around the world at the United Nations voted for a ceasefire. Only 14 countries voted against, and that included the United States and Israel. And you've got many European powers also going along with supporting Israel. And I think Britain is one of the kind of key countries apart from the United States that's doing that as a kind of junior partner of the United States. So I think what we're witnessing is a very extreme situation. I think there's a lot of understanding that this didn't start on the 7th of October. This is something that's been going on for 75 years. But also in the more recent period in terms of Gaza, we've got a 16-year siege, and it's horrendous. The United Nations has been describing it pretty much throughout this period as an open-air pit prison, the conditions in Gaza. So it's a desperate situation. We've had a number of wars that have taken place in terms of Israel launching attacks on Gaza, the Operation Cast Lead in 2008, and the Operation Protective Edge in 2014. But what we're seeing today is on a completely new scale. I mean, the deaths and the destruction is horrific. I think the latest figures in terms of deaths are over 16,000 people have been killed in just 8 weeks, and 7,000 of those are children. And I think what we've seen is huge outrage across the world. I mean, you mentioned the international protests, Youri. I mean, we're talking 2 million people in Jakarta, 1 million people in Turkey, in the Middle East. Yemen's come out on the streets, and then in Latin America, you've got a phenomena where in Cuba, the president of Cuba is leading the demonstrations, of massive demonstrations. But you're right. It's also in those countries where governments are supporting Israel. We've had massive demonstrations all over North America and in London, Glasgow, Cardiff, Edinburgh. It's been huge.
Like everywhere.
People
in Germany even defying bans on protests, and even defying the smear merchants and engaging in active protests. I mean, it's really quite quite remarkable.
And up against the backdrop of smears, of claims that if you support the Palestinians, you're somehow anti-Semitic, how these are hate marches. I mean, having marched alongside 1 million people, which was the biggest demonstration we've had in recent weeks in London, we're talking about families, young people, really diverse, really a kind of sea of humanity is how I would put it, and really friendly. Obviously, people are very angry and upset about what is happening, and I think that in terms of putting this in a kind of context of British social movements, in terms of the anti-war movement, I think this does actually. I think what's happening at the moment is actually a larger reaction than the war against than the protests against the war in Iraq, in terms of the size, and also how big they are and how many there's been. So I think that this is a really key moment in people's consciousness in the world. I mean, in the not just in Britain but across the world, people waking up to the horrors of what Israel is doing, and who's supporting it. It's the British government, it's the United States, and I think that that's a real watershed moment. But the real issue is that how not just us, but how is the world going to stop what's happening in terms of the Palestinians? Because what Israel is doing now that the sort of temporary humanitarian pause has ended is extreme. I mean, when we hear politician after politician after politician in Israel say, we want to destroy Gaza, we want to wipe Gaza off the planet, we want the Palestinians out of Gaza, get into this Sinai desert. When you hear politician after politician engage in this genocidal rhetoric, in outlining how their goal is for ethnic cleansing, I think you have to take it seriously when their actions match that, which is the bombardment, the indiscriminate bombardment of people's homes, hospitals, schools, all the vital infrastructure that you need to sustain life. And many Palestinians are saying the goal here is to make Gaza an unlivable situation so people can't survive. And I think the latest statistic is 60% of houses have been destroyed within Gaza. So you've got 1.6 million Palestinians displaced. This is an enormous crime, an enormous catastrophe, and the direction of travel in terms of what the Israelis are doing is very extreme. So now it is really crucial to kind of step up the international solidarity movement. We have to speak out as much as we can.
That's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, how do we translate this massive popular anger over Israel, this massive solidarity movement for Palestine, which clearly, just looking at the massive protests, everywhere, but especially in the West, including lots of Jewish anti-Zionists saying loud and clear, not in our name. But then how do we translate that into electoral politics in which politicians, especially from supposedly left-wing parties or liberal parties, how do we make them pay a price for their complicity and active participation in the crimes against humanity in Palestine when when you have parties like the NDP in Canada, which is supposed to be a social democratic party, but it's supportive of the Liberal Party's actions in, we stand by Israel come what may. The Democrats in the U.S., Britain, I don't have to tell you, both Labor and Liberal Democrats are very much supportive of Israel. So yeah, so how do we make Palestine into more of an electoral thing as opposed to just protesting, as George Galloway once said about, the Iraq War when he participated in a demonstration, the British public have voted with their feet and they have said loud and clear, no war on Iraq. How do we do that with Palestine?
Well, I mean, this is a really difficult kind of question that you're asking, because I mean, as much as I would like to say, all full steam ahead, we're going to win, this is going to be a very long and difficult fight. I don't think, we face a situation in the global north. This is what we're really talking about, the countries that are supporting Israel and basically financing it, arming it. I think the problem we've got is, within Britain, within the United States, there's bipartisan support for what's taking place, right? So there isn't like, not only is the governing parties supporting what's happening, but the opposition supports it too. And within
fake opposition, I would also say
again.
Fake opposition, I would also say.
Yeah, but as in, the potential next government. And I think that we've obviously had a process within, for example, the Labour Party and elsewhere, where there's been an attempt to shut down any alternative points of view on foreign policy. And that's had a very chilling effect. The conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, for example, being a real bigger issue here. But I think what's definitely happened over the past period of time is that the censorship and the attempt to silence people has been smashed through because of the reality of what's happening in Gaza and the massive movement. So that's kind of been broken through on. And, there has been a big campaigning taking place to lobby MPs to support a ceasefire. And you did see some level of, not rebellion, but people within the Labour politicians who are quite right-wing being forced actually to vote for a ceasefire, not because of their conscience, but because they're worried about losing their seat. And I think there are a number of MPs that are concerned about the electoral issues, because there are campaigns going on saying, if you don't vote for support a ceasefire, you won't get our vote. And I think that's very powerful in terms of putting pressure on particular MPs. I don't think it's enough to tip the balance. And I also think in situations, for example, in the United States, Biden is feeling the pressure from the polls because, a majority now of Americans support a ceasefire. The issue is the main alternative to Biden is Trump, who is no better at all. And on some issues, it's even worse than Biden. On some issues, even worse. But when it comes to war and the quest to maintain US hegemony, they're on the same page. They just want to pursue it in different ways. So I think that this is the reality we confront, which is that we on the issue of Palestine, there is majority sentiment for a ceasefire. Increasing numbers of people understand the underlying issues here around the oppression of the Palestinians. This is about an occupation. This is about a siege which Israel is waging. So there's an increase in consciousness, and I think that's where we kind of have to put our efforts, is in building a movement, raising people's consciousness, because this isn't going to be a quick fight in terms of changing governments in the global north. We have actually had an increasing of a right-wing orientation in the global north countries. What you've seen over the recent period is more and more European governments actually subordinating their foreign policy to the United States in this whole massive geopolitical struggle that the United States is trying to wage against China and the global south. So we've seen that in the war in Ukraine, where most of the European powerful countries have gone along with that proxy war, funding Ukraine, supporting that proxy war against Russia. And we're seeing increasing slide on the question of China in terms of more countries in the global north going along with that. So that is the trajectory, and we're in a bad place from the point of view of progressive forces, but we have to realize that we've got forces in the global south that are in a majority that are against that, and we're going to have to link up with that and build an opposition from the point of view of the minority. So I'd love to say, you know, we've got the power to get governments that are going to stand for peace and justice, but I don't think that is on the horizon. But that doesn't mean to give up. What it means is we have to build consciousness, build movements, and prepare for a long struggle. And it's not something we can say this is too difficult, we can't engage in it, because, you know, as we're seeing in Gaza, look what's happening. This is what the United States stands for. You know, they're losing in economic competition to China, so they're going more and more towards showing their power militarily. So we can expect the US to become more aggressive and more militaristic as it's declining. What they are doing, they're not funding climate solutions, they're not building infrastructure. What they're doing is pouring more money every year into the military, because that is what they think is going to make them succeed in defending their global hegemony. So I think it's really crucial that we have that perspective, and we can't duck out of this fight of building a powerful peace movement. But there's not going to be quick wins. We have to like really focus on explaining the situation, what's going on, against a barrage of propaganda, disinformation, and lies. And that's a very challenging job. But that is, I think, the principal task that the anti-war movement has, as well as mobilizing the opposition that there already is. We have to kind of grow that opposition and strengthen it, and strengthen the understanding of, you know, it's not just a permanent ceasefire that we need. That's not going to resolve the problem. The siege on Gaza, 16 years it's been taking place for 16 years. That needs to end. What about Palestinians' right to self-determination? You know, in the West Bank, you know, Israel is
exactly
illegal
BDS,
settlements,
democratic one-state secular solution.
Yeah. So we've got a long way to go, but I think that there's massive mobilization. People are waking up across the world about the reality of what's going on.
Before I ask you about how we also mobilize against the new Cold War on China, the pivot to Asia, and hopefully no escalation, but the powers to be do want to escalate their war on China, I do have to ask then about this about the return of this particular politician, the return of David Cameron, who's been appointed by the current Tory government of Rishi Sunak as foreign minister. This is the man who lit Libya on fire, Syria on fire, and Ukraine on fire. And Brexit, I won't get into that. Like, regardless whether someone was a progressive leaver or a progressive remainder. I mean, this was the guy who called for a referendum on Brexit, and his entire half of his party, the right-wing newspapers that support him, his own backer, Rupert Murdoch, was all overwhelmingly for leave. He calls the referendum, he loses the referendum, and then lets everybody else clean up the mess of it. And now he's a member of not just foreign minister, but the House of Lords. So how frightened should we be with David Cameron back as foreign minister? And I also do believe it was under his premiership where he also started to go along with the U.S. in the pivot to Asia, the new Cold War on China, right?
I think it's a really good question, Youri. I mean, it's I think Vijay Prashad, the Indian scholar, put it really well, actually, in a recent webinar that No Cold War Britain hosted. And he said, the appointment of David Cameron as Foreign Secretary is a reason for hilarity and alarm. And I thought that was quite a good way of putting it. And I think he as he explained, there's such a narrow, can't you find anyone else? You have to go back to this quite failed politician that had, kind of quite a catastrophic end to his career in terms of, but it just goes to show, you can make a comeback if you're a very right-wing warmonger. And I think, you kind of outlined the way in which, David Cameron has his credentials as a warmonger. And really, at the moment in Britain, that's the main condition from the point of view of the ruling class, from the point of view of imperialism. The main issue is, are you a warmonger? Because as we've been discussing, the situation that we're facing is the threat of more and more hot wars. Let's not forget, it's only a couple of years ago that the so-called war on terror ended, and we were told that that's the end of the forever wars. Well, since then, the United States has deliberately provoked a proxy war against a nuclear armed state in Ukraine against Russia. So that's that, and that's gone catastrophically. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, all because the United States wants to weaken Russia. So all of these Ukrainian people are just being treated like cannon fodder. And now we've got this massive war in Gaza. So it's not a peace-loving moment. You know, we've not gone from the wars in the Middle East and North Africa into like a new era of peace. Actually, things are escalating. You know, there's a qualitative escalation taking place. So I think it is appropriate from the point of view of their side that David Cameron's taken the helm, because he's got the credentials on that. I mean, you mentioned Libya. I mean, NATO's war on aggression against Libya in 2011 saw open-air slave markets return to a nation that once boasted Africa's highest human development index. You know, this was a catastrophe. So I think that's the key thing, is he's a warmonger, and that's what's needed at this time from the point of view of imperialism. And the other thing is that, as we're discussing today, Cameron's actually visiting Washington to go and meet with you know, Blinken and various other high-ranking politicians in the United States. And that's exactly appropriate, because he's just been made the foreign secretary, so now he's going to his masters, which is, you know, because we've got to be clear that British foreign policy is made in Washington. And in reference to Brexit, the one thing that has certainly done is made Britain more dependent and more subordinated to the United States, because that's the dynamic of things. I mean, it is the situation that Europe as a whole, in terms of particularly Western Europe, is becoming more subordinate anyway to the United States, but Britain is sort of leading the way in that sense. You know, and you've got the same situation in terms of the Labour opposition. So David Lammy, he makes a big thing about how he's an Atlanticist, and that nothing's going to change under him. So I think that's the case. Is like, that's the credentials that you need: warmonger and Atlanticist. And I think David Cameron does fit into that. And the key thing is, you know, we're at a moment of great, because this conversation is obviously talking about the negative elements of things, which is these huge threats to humanity in terms of war. But the reason it's happening is because actually some really fundamental, and I would say positive, changes are happening in the world. You've got the rise of China, which concretely means for hundreds of millions of people being brought out of poverty, and it means that there's, you know, what is China's international initiatives? You've got the United States bombing war. Well, China's, at the same time as this taking place, has been hosting, I think, 140 countries in China for the Belt and Road Initiative Forum, and that's about investment, eliminating poverty worldwide. And that's, the United States doesn't have a project like that. And you've also got the rise of the global South in general, not just China, but you've got, you know, the advance of BRICS, the fact that that's expanding from January. And when that happens, you know, they get the BRICS countries, well, I actually think it's already the case, but it's going to be more the case once they expand, that's going to represent more in terms of global GDP than the G7. So these are historic shifts that are taking place in the world. And the thing about the United States and Britain as its junior partner is they are positioning themselves to fight against these trends in the world. They want to try and stop it. And I think that's kind of why you have to call upon more experience, although let's be clear, he's failed a lot in terms of David Cameron, but you know, it's more experienced politicians that are reliable politicians for imperialism. So, but I think the agenda is clear. You know, it's to basically try and sustain US power in the world and US hegemony in the world, and I think David Cameron's completely on board with that.
Well, scary times ahead, but this is why we need, you know, the anti-imperialist movement to constantly step its game up. And speaking of that, that leads to this question, which is you know, I'm curious if you've been having difficulty in mobilizing the left in general to be against the pivot to Asia, and not fall for some of the most extreme, outlandish propaganda we get on China, whether it's the myths regarding Hong Kong and Taiwan particularly Hong Kong being, you know, this wonderful liberal democracy before the evil Chinese have recolonized it, Yes, some people do use that language. Or
Yes, certainly a
Taiwan.
decolonization. There's decolonization.
Yes. You do get that, and I mentioned to you off the air. I'm gonna protect this. I'm gonna protect this journalist's name and background. But there's a journalist I follow, and the person was sharing on their social media this big protest that was happening against Palestine. But the people there were saying things like free Palestine, free Congo, free West Papua, free Sudan. I completely agree with all of that. But then they would say and free Tigray and free the Uyghurs and stuff like that. And then I've noticed, there was another, journalist that I follow that was sharing on their social media, demand, a bunch of posts demanding that Puma boycotts China for forced labor of Uyghurs in the Xinjiang. And so we have this issue of of leftists who might be great on other anti-imperialist issues like Palestine, Congo, West Papua, and so forth, but then they fall for the very same Western propaganda, like when we talk about Tigray, which is a whole other topic in Ethiopia, but the West is actually supporting a reactionary movement. They're not supporting Ethiopian action against a secessionist movement. But then again, with China, you have people who say that oh, Hong Kong was this wonderful liberal democracy, and now it's under the boot of Chinese capitalism. And then, of course, the thing with the Uyghurs, that China is an institutional Islamophobic country. So yeah, I'm curious your response to that, and how do we who are trying to mobilize people against the pivot to Asia not fall for it, because I'm pretty sure you'll also find people who say, I don't want a new Cold War with China, but come on, Fiona, come on, Youri, look at what China's doing to the Uyghurs, look at what China's doing in Hong Kong, and we gotta mobilize, and we have to support, you know, NATO actions against Taiwan and all that jazz. So I'm curious your response.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. There's quite a lot of questions you've asked in one. But I mean, just first of all, I just
That's
want to
always my
say,
problem. I always
no,
ask
it's okay. So I might not
questions.
succeed. I might not succeed in answering everything, but I just want to start by saying, that Britain ruled Hong Kong with an iron fist for over 150 years. There was no democracy. Human rights were trampled on. And so I just think the starting point for any conversation actually about Hong Kong and freedom and democracy, if you're British, does actually need to start with that, because actually what happened in 1997 was decolonization. And so I think, and it's still the case that, British government wants to intervene, United States is intervening, and they're definitely intervening in other places in China as well in order to sow division and weaken China, like they do with other countries all over the world. They fund opposition groups, they interfere into elections, they fund think tanks, and in many cases they wage wars, they organize coups. So this is what the United States does, and they do it in every single country in the world, obviously, and they try their best to do that in China as well. And one of the things in terms of the propaganda you were raising is like, real strengths of China are turned into weaknesses through lies. I mean, so you take the issue of Xinjiang, the Uyghurs. I mean, the situation is actually improving. The living standards of the people in Xinjiang have been improving. Poverty. When it's said, by the World Bank, extreme poverty has been eliminated in China, and 850 million people have been brought out of poverty. That does include people in Xinjiang, by the way, which has been one of the more poorer regions in terms of China.
But Fiona, at what price, though?
Yeah, and then the situation right now. It's not to say there's not any problems in China. There is inequality, and basically during the kind of period of reform and opening up, there's actually the east of China that was developed, and the coastal regions that were developed up much more than more inland and to the west. So actually things like the Belt and Road Initiative and the kind of project that the Chinese government has at the moment of I think it's called Common Prosperity, and the crackdown on billionaires. That is actually about kind of dealing with problems that there are within China in terms of, you know, still improving people's living standards, social conditions. You know, they're definitely on a mission to improve people's living standards. It's not the case that this is a done deal, because people say, well, you know, there's still social problems in China. Well, of course, it's a massive country, 1.4 billion people. They've just eliminated extreme poverty, and there's obviously a long way to go to get common prosperity to become what their goal is, which is a moderately prosperous society. And actually, the United States is trying to stop that. They are trying to stop that progress. They're against all these people being brought out of poverty. They're against China having all these, you know, brilliant infrastructure in terms of high-speed rail, all this green technology, and they want to stop that. But in terms of, like, for example, Xinjiang, you know, the idea that there's a genocide is absolutely ridiculous. A genocide is what is happening right now in Gaza. You've not seen any images like that coming out of China. It's not happening. That's why you haven't seen that. You know, there are 24,000 mosques in Xinjiang province. That's a huge number. You know, the language, the Uyghur language is protected. People's rights are protected. So it's not to say the situation is perfect, but there are very blatant lies told about China. And I think it's what's said is the kind of saying is the first victim in a war is the truth. And I think that's what we're seeing with this Cold War, quite intense Cold War against China. So yes, that's kind of what I say. That there's a lot of debunking that needs to be done, and some really great outlets have done some fantastic investigative journalism on this. For example, the Grey Zone. I think that the Morning Star does some really great coverage of this as well for people in Britain who follow the Morning Star. That's a really good outlet to go to. But I also
he unfortunately is not alive anymore. God rest his soul. But I had Omar Latif, who was quite a who was quite a progressive far left Pakistani Canadian, who actually went to Xinjiang. This was sometime way before this was sometime before the pandemic, and he found no evidence that there was institutional Islamophobia, and he went to many places where they had halal meat. People would, people were allowed to, like, grow their beards out and so forth like that. The language, the language of the Uyghur people was, was there, bilingual sites, and he said that he felt that there just was no evidence to support that there was either an active genocide, cultural genocide, or even institutional Islamophobia, apart from lots of security. But that's because of, terrorism, because of, like, Uyghur separatist movements. But yeah, so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and I mean, the situation in Gaza, we're finding out about what's going on. We are seeing in lifetime what a genocide is, and it's extremely racist to suggest that the Uyghur people wouldn't be able to explain that to the world if they were facing anywhere near the conditions that are happening in Gaza. It's not happening. We would know about it. There would be images. That's what a genocide looks like. But the thing I would say is in terms of building a movement, you can have whatever criticisms you want to have of China. The issue is, are you against a Cold War? And that's very important, because it affects the whole of humanity. But if you take a British person, do you want billions and billions of pounds to be going on into upgrading our weapon systems, sending aircraft carriers over to the Pacific, having these military agreements with Japan and Australia? Do you want that, and then potentially be part of an operation to provoke a third world war, which could turn nuclear against China? So first of all, that's going to cost us a lot of money, but also it could actually eliminate the human race. So, you can have your criticisms of China, and as no Cold War, we're a broad tent. There are people with a whole range of views. We're not, we're not supporters of China. We're against the Cold War. That's where we draw the line. And so I think that's what people need to reflect on. That. And actually, what we have is that I think in a lot of progressive circles in the West is just to sort of swallow the propaganda from the West, and also basically sit on the fence, or just sort of not take a position against what the US and Britain are doing and other Western powers are doing against China. And that is, if you stay neutral in those sorts of situations, then you're aligning with the oppressed. So I think that's kind of part of the issue. And yes, that needs to be addressed. And I think that, I haven't got any, like, again, an easy answer for you, Youri, in terms of how do we get the left to understand more about what's going on. But this is the key struggle of our time. So we have to, because one of the reasons why the United States will not support a ceasefire in Gaza is because, they want to make a point about how powerful they are, and there are geopolitical dimensions to this, which is that their hegemony is in decline, their influence is in decline, and they are desperate to demonstrate that that's not the case. And what they've got isn't a Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure projects. What they've got is their bombs. And so we're kind of seeing a really diabolical situation in Gaza because of that.
Actually, I was just thinking about this right now because you were talking about the millions that is spent on militarism and how awful that is, just in the domestic economy, but also, when we talk about, the pivot to Asia and mobilizing against China, there's the bad effects that it has on us because it's diverting from a Green New Deal and from, actually raising people's wages to spending 2% of our GDP on militarism. But what that also means is that it means that South Korea is permanently under the Anglo-US pan-European empires to keep stuck in the Cold War instead of trying to have at least détente with North Korea. It means militarizing Japan more and making people of places like Okinawa suffer under Japanese militarism, in which you have U.S. fighter jets, destroy, the environment, make lots of noise pollutions, and when, war games go wrong, people dying under, under failed, fighter jets, and even, the sexual abuses of, U.S. military bases and whatnot, abusing the local population and getting away literally with murders and rapes and stuff like that. And then when we talk about supporting Taiwan, okay, I can understand that some people think that Taiwan should be an independent country, which I think is a whole another topic for another day. But when we talk about supporting Taiwan, it's like when we talk about stand with Ukraine, it means you're supporting the West's support for the most reactionary movements in Taiwan and in Ukraine. Like, the West never supports, popular left movements or anything like that in any country. So that's what I find just so baffling when when leftists, especially ones who can use their brains 100% on Palestine and being against the Iraq War, fall for this. I'm curious your response on. Yeah, I'm just curious your response on that.
Yeah, well, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, you've put it very eloquently, Youri. So I haven't got a lot to add, but I mean, I think that with the situation on Taiwan, let's compare that to the situation with Russia. I mean, Russia was saying for quite a long time, expansion of NATO up to our border is a red line. We're not going to tolerate that. And this isn't me saying this. This is quite right-wing foreign policy strategists within the United States are saying this was done deliberately to provoke Russia to intervene into Ukraine. So all of this discussion about it was unprovoked is a complete lie, and that's why the West have been so determined to keep on saying it, because it's the exact opposite of what happened. They deliberately provoked the situation in Ukraine because they want a war with Russia. They want to weaken Russia. And I think when we look at the issue of Taiwan, I mean, the international situation in terms of the international community is overwhelming recognition that Taiwan is part of China. Obviously, there's a different system, but it's part of China. And that is the reddest of red line for China. This is a question of their sovereignty, their self-determination. And we have to learn from what's happened in terms of the question on in Europe, because the United States have deliberately provoked a major war in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people have died in the last couple of years. And they're trying to provoke a war in the Pacific, in Asia, and that needs to be avoided at all costs, because just like the situation in Europe, there's a real risk of this going nuclear. And whereas Asia has been experiencing in the last few decades, stability, not major wars. So there's been economic growth, people's living standards have improved. That's a good situation compared to the past. And the United States wants to disrupt that and kind of create chaos and instability and have a war. And that's just, are you for or against that is the question. And the idea that the United States is responding to aggression from China is just, it's just completely made up. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm keeping
Exactly. Yeah,
mad
exactly.
is what I was going to say, but it's just not in the realms of reality. The situation of not just China but many countries in that area, there are disputes in terms of in the South China Sea, but every country in that region wants to have peace, stability. They don't want a major war. But the United States is coming in and they're trying to get, well, they're getting Japan to rearm. They're trying to get South Korea to be on board with the new Cold War. They're trying to get India involved in military agreements against China. There's a constant, relentless attempt to try and bolster this military build-up against China by the United States and to draw in other countries. Obviously, Australia and Japan have gone fully along with that they're trying to make inroads in South Korea. And like I said, with India as well, there's a bit more resistance to this in India, but they want to create a war in Asia. And why? Because they see the rise of China economically as a major threat. And so it's sort of like they'd rather destroy the situation than allow a more multipolar, more democratic world with where there would still be a powerful country, by the way, but there'll be other countries that are powerful too. They don't want that. They want a unipolar world where they're in charge. It's sort of like a global dictatorship, essentially.
Unbelievable. And then I think sort of like then two last questions is just have to ask this because you are based in the UK. What you think about Cruella de Vil, Braverman woman, Braverman, Howard woman, oh whatever is her stupid name, but Suella Braverman. I'm just curious, your response on her being demoted. But could we see her rise as a potential Tory leader if hypothetically Rishi Sunak loses an election to Keir Starmer? And the last time we talked a bit about the unnecessary divides that exist on the left between the whole identity politics versus the class struggle thing. And I'm just curious, and I'm just curious how do you think we try to overcome those divisions and explain to some of our white socialist Marxist friends that this is how we chew gum and walk at the same time?
Well, again, a lot to unpack there, Youri. I mean, I think in terms of Suella Braverman, I think obviously at the moment that she was sacked, it was she was really pitching herself against the whole Palestine movement in Britain, calling the demonstrations hate marches, when I think they were like love marches in reality, because it's about a love for humanity and a hatred of war. That's what it was, a hatred of war. And all the attempts to criminalize pro-Palestinians, saying, chanting the slogan "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," as they want to throw people in jail for saying that. I mean, this is a call for freedom. This is a call against colonialism, occupation, oppression, and apartheid. It's a call for a society based on equality, inclusion, and human rights. There's nothing hateful about it. It's a cry for freedom. So I think it was very significant that the timing of when she went, I do think it was connected to the real embarrassment of her in terms of versus the Palestine solidarity movement. But I think your question points to this. We shouldn't take that as a kind of permanent situation. I think that the far right, I mean, already taking away Braverman and having the more moderates in, let's be clear, we've still got a far right Tory government. Like, just because the kind of goalposts have moved so much over the past few years, let's not lose sight of the fact that the more moderate government we have now is far right. And whilst with or without Braverman, racism is absolutely central to the Tory government's strategy. and for their agenda in opposition, which is likely in the next general election, as you refer to, they're likely to lose the next general election next year. And so racism is going to be really key, because what have they got to offer the people? Austerity, living standards are falling, and obviously inflation's still high, the cost of living is going up. The situation for ordinary people across the board is getting worse in Britain, however you want to measure it. So what they've got is divide and rule and scapegoating, and it's a very tried and tested, effective propaganda technique, because they want to radicalize, maybe even a minority of the population, because they don't need over 50% to win an election. They need to have a hardened core. And I think that's what we're going to see more of. And I think that, unfortunately, where we're heading is for a Labour-led government, maybe a Labour majority, maybe a Labour minority government, led by Keir Starmer, and who's going to be on a very similar agenda to the Tory government. Austerity, I think racism will be playing a big part as well, and war and climate vandalism. Maybe slightly less climate vandalism than the Tories, but we'll wait and see on that. But not doing anywhere near enough to actually solve the problem. And I think waiting in the wings is going to be the far right, and they will just say all of this is to blame because of immigrants, all of this is to blame because of Muslims. And I think that's what they're going to do. And I mean, obviously this is completely nonsensical, but look what's happening in the United States. Donald Trump was a disaster, and we're a year out from the US presidential election, and he's ahead in the polls, ahead of Biden in the polls. And so there is a real connection in Britain to the far right in the United States. If you look at the whole Brexit movement, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump were really behind that, and actually, we have a political system which is moving more in the direction of what is happening in the United States. So I think let's not rule out, the kind of rise again of Braverman, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage. I think they've got nothing to offer positively. All they have is hate. All they have is dividing people, because the situation is going to get worse for people. So I think that we have to be prepared for that reality, because there's no point to sort of thinking, oh hooray, she's gone. I think that the dynamics and the polarization in global north countries and it's happening in Europe as well as the US. So we have to be prepared that the struggle against racism is absolutely essential. And I just want to then link to the next question you had about identity politics, wokeism. There's going to be no victories for the working class in global north countries if the left in any way succumbs to this racism. And I would argue, unless the left, progressive movements, fight ferociously against racism, because it is the key weapon of the right to divide the working class, and we've seen time and again that that's very effective. And I think and the
but
other
also,
question,
but also heteronormativity, because I know because I know because just analyzing Britain, I've noticed kind of the rise of transphobia, and it's not just ridiculous far right outlets like Spike GB News or the Sun engaged in it. Sometimes we unfortunately see fellow lefties also engage in it, and then sometimes I personally think that we should be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. We can we can deal with white supremacy and eradicate capitalism, sexism and eradicate the patriarchy and eradicate capitalism, and heteronormativity, and that includes the transgender rights, and eradicating capitalism. But sometimes you have some on the left who complain that this is identity politics gone mad. This is too much wokeism. Why can't we just focus on the class issue? Which often is, just dog whistle for don't talk to me about white supremacy, patriarchy, and heteronormativity, especially if it's trans rights. So that's what. So and it kind of goes to how do we make Palestine electoral issue? Because it seems as if every time we're just right there, some on the left, fall for the very propaganda. They claim that they are resistant to right-wing propaganda, but they'll fall for it, and then we're just back into all of us at loggerheads, basically.
Yeah, I think all forms of oppression are sharpening. I think, and I mean, you know, if you take the position of women, for example, Youri, like, you know, all of this situation with austerity, which was really intensified during the pandemic, all these cuts to social support in terms of, you know, support for the elderly, sick, childcare, who does this all fall on? It falls on women, and they're expected to just take that up and do that without any compensation, which is what's happening, because, you know, the social support in society is declining because of these cuts, and so you're getting a greater repression of women. And this is going on at the same time as, you know, there are attacks on abortion rights, there are you know, an increase of misogyny, and it's because the position of women in society is going backwards, and so there's an ideological offensive as well. I mean, obviously women have come a long way, we have come a long way in terms of situation over many decades, but at this particular moment in time there is a pushback, because you know, it's the same with you know, with disabled people, like really harsh austerity.
I was just thinking that I didn't want to interrupt you
No,
to like throw that in. But
exactly,
yes,
and then and with everything, you know, it's divide. You know, the approach. So, you know, there is a huge increase in transphobia, and it's being used to divide people, I think, and to distract people. And, you know, the struggle for trans liberation is something that socialists should champion, and the way it's being, this whole debate is being whipped up, and all this transphobia is being whipped up, and just the way the debate is taking place, it is designed to distract people from the key issues, which is we need to fight for women's liberation, we need to fight for trans liberation, we need to fight for disability rights, we need to fight against racism. It's a distraction, because it's also completely blown out of proportion, some of the things that are said, and it takes away from the actual issue at hand, which is like socialists, you know, this whole point that you were saying about identity politics is not class politics. This is quite a fundamental debate in the socialist movement, because actually I would say that the socialist position is that the struggle for women's liberation, black liberation, gay liberation, trans liberation, etc., the liberation of humanity, let's put it like that, that's the struggle for socialism. It's not we want more workers' rights, it's not that we want, you know, more holiday pay. We do want that, that's what we want, but we want humanity to flourish, to not be oppressed. You know, it's why socialists support national liberation movements, why, you know, socialists should be supporting the Palestinians, because, you know, we support their rights to have self-determination. So sometimes it's not just on identity politics, as people say identity politics, I like to call it about oppression and discrimination of groups in society, but it's also on an international scale, where people who are, say, from the British left or the US left, they think the class struggle is, you know, British worker, maybe they've got a hard hat on and they're a white man, versus the boss. And they don't see it as an international struggle, where actually Britain is part of an imperialist system which is oppressing countries in the global south. And then within society, it's sort of like, well, you know, fighting against sexism and racism isn't important. Well, as we've discussed, it's very important to the Tories and the ruling class to have racism, because they're using that very effectively to divide the working class. So, you know, the other point is we can't win if you make concessions to racism and sexism. We can't win, because the whole point is we do outnumber people, we do outnumber the other side, but not if you divide your own side and don't actually champion the interests and the rights of all the people that are oppressed. So yeah, that's kind of how I kind of see it.
This is a person who knows how to chew gum and walk at the same time, and I wish more lefties could just do that. But
well, let's work on it, Youri. Let's work on
but clearly, yes, but clearly on all of these issues, like, we have our work cut out for us. But this is why we need to keep mobilizing political education, and we have to do it on, you know, all fronts, because it is really all hands on deck when we talk about the climate crisis. And it is no exaggeration to say that, like, accidental nuclear war could actually happen if we continue, you know, feeding the NATO war machine, and as well as the pivot to Asia. So, but we were joined on this, and that's a perfect place to close. And yes, power to the people, and death to imperialism and all that stuff. And and well, Fiona, before we end, is there anything else you want to address, just before we close, and the message to send to our fellow lefties who, you know, are on the fence when it comes to mobilizing against a new Cold War with China, and some who do get themselves, boxed in on unnecessary identity versus class, when it should be, no, they're two sides of the same coin, and we need to fight the ruling class. Anything else you want to say before we close?
Well, I think what I would like to emphasize, actually, Youri, is that this struggle to support the Palestinians is just the most important issue right now in the world. And the stakes are huge. I think for Israel and for US imperialism, they need to win to show their power, to show that they're not weak, etc. But from our side of things, from the Palestinian side of things, this is about the survival of the Palestinian people against potential ethnic cleansing, genocide, and it's also the implications of this will have a big impact internationally as well. So I think it's absolutely crucial that people get to their protests locally, etc. I don't know when this is going out, Youri. There's a demonstration on Saturday. Maybe this particular recording won't go out before then, but just to say, we need to keep mobilizing flat out for the Palestinians, and it does make a difference. It doesn't feel like it at times, but in terms of the grain. Someone used to say to me, "Oh, can you put one grain of sand into an issue, put it on the right side?" And I think that's what we have to do on the issue of Palestine. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that people power makes a difference. So we have to be flat out mobilizing on this issue.
I'll also just say, for people who are very concerned about the environment, you cannot be an environmentalist, let alone eco-socialist, and tolerate tolerate militarism. So folks, if you're an environmentalist, you do have to mobilize against NATO and the pivot to Asia, and be supportive of Titan, because the only way we're going to even avoid the worst of climate change is if all of our scientists and all of our people work with the Chinese, with the Russians, with the Iranians, and whomever our ruling class deems an enemy, in order to, live on Earth, or give the Earth's life lungs, more of an expensive lifespan. But on that note, we are joined on this edition of 1+1 with the brilliant Fiona Edwards of No Cold War Britain, Eyes on Latin America, and the contributor to Morning Star. Fiona, thank you so much for coming on the program. And if I'm not in touch with, if I'm not in touch with you in the coming weeks, Merry Christmas, or Happy Holidays, or Happy Hanukkah, or whatever is the holiday that you celebrate with you and your comrades. All right.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Likewise.